Good morning. My name is Richard Hanley. I'm the director of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. And welcome to all of you here. We have an interesting program today. The New York, New Jersey Waterfront Commission was started in 1953. And it is now being litigated in the United States Supreme Court, or soon will be. And we're going to talk about the Waterfront Commission, but we're going to do it via a story. So we're going to have a program today that is in three parts. Our first speaker, Joseph Sciorra from Queens College, is going to speak about Pete Panto, an interesting, tragic figure in the history of Brooklyn's waterfront. And it is good to ground this discussion that we'll have in some real people, and in particular, this real person whom Joseph has researched and whose story he will be telling us. Then we will talk about the condition of the waterfront in the 1940s and 1950s, the level of corruption that actually led to Senate hearings and then ultimately to a 1953 creation of the New York, New Jersey Waterfront Commission. And then we'll conclude with Rai Ravad, who's going to talk about the reason why this commission at this time is its future existence is in somewhat of question, and why and how that commission and its existence got before the Supreme Court. And so even though at this point, Brooklyn docks handle only about 10%, and New Jersey is more like handling 50% of the New York harbor and port trade, Brooklyn is still involved in this, and there's still port activity on the Brooklyn waterfront. And so it is interesting, of interest to us and to all those of you who have registered and are interested in things of the Brooklyn waterfront. So now I will begin by introducing to you Joseph Sciorra, who is, as I mentioned, he's at Queens College. He's the director for academic and cultural programs at the John D. Calandra Italian-American Institute at Queens College. And what Joseph does in that role is he implements scholarly research, public programs. They have an annual conference. There's a Writers Read series that the Institute sponsors. They have a film series called Documented Italians. And there's also exhibitions that they curate. Joseph received his PhD in the Department of Folklore and Folklife at the University of Pennsylvania. So he's a folklorist. He researches and publishes on vernacular culture, including religious practices, cultural landscapes, and popular music, among other topics. So it is my pleasure to welcome Joseph Sciorra to the virtual Brooklyn waterfront. Joseph.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. I would like to show some images while I do my presentation, and let me know if you can see this. All good on the
Yes.
images? Okay,
yes.
Great. So my story is one of a sort of historical retrieval, memory work, if you will, and a form of cultural activism. And I want to tell talk about this character, this figure, this important, I think, labor activist, Pietro P. Panto, but vis-a-vis the ways in which I discovered him and what I've been doing to keep the memory of Panto alive and the sort of courageous work that he was involved in on the Brooklyn docks in the late 1930s. So I first heard of Panto in the late 1980s in the now defunct Italian language daily America Oggi, in which the playwright Arthur Miller was interviewed about his recently published memoir, Time Bends, in which he describes going after the war along the Brooklyn docks and seeing chalked graffiti along various walls and pillars of buildings.
Joseph, excuse me, may I?
Yeah.
May I interrupt
Sure.
for a moment?
Sure.
It looks like we've been hacked and somebody's bombarding the chat and questions with obscenities and hate talk. And this is our first experience with this. So excuse us. Jasmine, who's our who's hosting, who's taking care of this, is trying to eliminate those from the chat and the Q&A. So because this is a webinar, they cannot be heard, they cannot be seen, who's ever doing this. Their only presence is noted in the chat and the Q&A. And so while Joseph is presenting to the audience, I suggest we just look and listen to Joseph and forget about what's going on in the Q&A and the chat, and we'll be taking care of that. Sorry, I apologize. Joseph.
It happens. It happens all too often, unfortunately. So as I was saying, Arthur Miller had seen this graffiti that said in both Italian and English, Dove Pete Panto? Where is Pete Panto? And I read, after reading this article, this interview with Miller, I went out and got Time Bends, and I discovered by reading Miller's excerpts of Panto that Panto was a labor activist who had been murdered for organizing rank and file workers against the mob-controlled and utterly corrupt labor union at the time, the International Longshoremen's Associations, and his assassins were never brought to trial. In his memoir, it's curious that Miller recounts that he wrote a screenplay called The Hook, which he and the director Elia Kazan pitched to Hollywood, but that the Hollywood moguls there wanted them to switch the mobster villains and to turn them into communists, and the two declined. Now, of course, Kazan, we know, went on to make the film On the Waterfront with a dock theme, and Miller wrote the play A View from the Bridge, a very different story than that of Pete Panto, but still situated on the dock. I'm very excited to let people know that in the summer of 2023, next year, the Brave New World Repertory Theater will stage Miller's play The Hook on the Brooklyn dock. So stay tuned for that as the year comes on. So as a scholar of Italian-American cultural history, I was intrigued by Panto's story, in part because of his heroism, because of his martyrdom, but also because labor activists like Panto, as well as Carlo Tresca and Angela Bambace, are missing from the constructed pantheon of individuals that self-proclaimed Italian-American spokespeople champion as heroes. And I was interested in reclaiming Panto's story, in part as an Italian-American story that has, to some degree, been forgotten. So I'm not a historian, as Richard mentioned. I'm a folklorist by training, and let alone I'm not a labor historian. So I relied on my discovering of Panto on William Mello's interesting work on the Brooklyn docks, as well as, and he's a labor historian, as well as Nathan Ward's excellent book, Dark Harbors. So I really suggest if people are interested in learning more about Panto and his historic aspects of the dock, to check out these two books. So my fascination with Panto was so great that when I started working at the Calandra Institute in 2000. Literally, one of the first things I did was organize a panel called Italians on the New York Waterfront, a tribute to Pete Panto. So a little bit about Panto and the docks at the time. In the late 30s, Panto was a longshoreman on the Brooklyn waterfront. He was born in Brooklyn. He was brought back to Sicily and lived some of his life there. We can tell from Ellis Island documents that he came back at least twice to New York City from Sicily, but he was born in Brooklyn. The working conditions, as some of you may know, on the docks were horrid, with endemic problems such as the shape-up hiring system, where men had to wait daily and be chosen to work, mandatory salary kickbacks, extortion, and high rates of work-related injuries. I had read once where the dock workers in general had the second highest work-related injuries in the country. In addition, the local union, as I mentioned, the International Longshoremen's Association at the time was rife with corruption, political patronage, and mob-controlled violence. Enforcing the status quo of this foul fiefdom was the gangster Albert Anastasia, head of the crime syndicate Murder, Inc. So now, given these conditions, Panto led a group of dock workers who organized what they called the Brooklyn Rank and File Committee to fight for labor conditions, for better conditions. And in the summer of 1939, they held open-air meeting with hundreds and hundreds of men assembling at the docks, demanding change. The mobbed-up union goons threatened Panto to stop his activism for workers' rights and offered him money, threatened him, offered him money, and tried to really circumvent the successful work that he was doing with various dock workers there in Brooklyn. So finally, on July 14th, 1939, Panto was killed on orders of Anastasia, and his body was dumped in a lime pit in Lindenhurst, New Jersey. And this is the New York Police Department's missing persons information that was sent out to the various newspapers. I've just retrieved this document, really excited, over the summer from the New York City's Municipal Archive, and it was the only thing that they had on Panto. And what's, I think, particularly important about this is that we have an image of Panto that over the years, if you go online and search Panto, is an image that has been increasingly distorted in its replication. And here we see this guy, we see him as a young man that he was, and a really wonderful photograph that we're able to see him. So as I said, his nobody was brought to trial. There was, I'm just showing you some, this is a pamphlet that was published about Panto. Wasn't until January 1941 that Panto's decayed corpse was discovered. This is his funeral cortege in Brooklyn. I'm just going to show you some images. So as I said, Panto was buried in St. Charles Cemetery in an unmarked grave. And some have speculated, Nathan Ward in particular, that there was a concern that Anastasia's men would come to desecrate Panto's resting place. So in March, as part of this kind of cultural retrieval, historical retrieval, in March, I initiated, as part of the Calandra Institute's campaign, to raise funds for a tombstone for Pete Panto. And I'm happy to say that the installation of the marker is scheduled for the spring of next year. Excuse me. This quote here, this working man from off the docks, our martyr in the fray. Again, I thank Nathan Ward for bringing this to my attention. It was part of the a newsletter that was printed by dock workers. It was called The Shape Up. Copies of it are found in the Tanneman Library in New York University. And this was an excerpt from a larger poetic tribute to Panto. The name on the bottom, which is for Pasquale Patsy Scotto, whose family owned the funeral parlor in the Red Hook, South Brooklyn, now Carroll Gardens neighborhood. And the Catholic Church requires that since he owns the plot, his name needs to be on the tombstone. There's two Scotto families in that area historically, the Scotto families of the funeral parlor and another Scotto family that has more problematic associations with organized crime. So please don't get those two confused. So that's my presentation, just a sort of an attempt to keep the memory of Pete Panto alive, this labor activist, Italian-American working class hero, present in the minds for the future generations. So thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. I appreciate that. And it will ground our discussion in a real person and, all the research that you've done on him. And we see a young man, idealistic young man, and a martyr, as it said. By the way, excuse us for what has happened. We've been doing Zoom breakfast talks and annual conference since COVID. And I guess we've been very fortunate because we've never had the problem we just experienced. I do know that when you purchase webinars, you actually have a real person contact at Zoom, the company. And so I will be reaching out to that person and seeing how we can make sure this doesn't happen again. So I apologize. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you a colleague of mine from City Tech. And it is always nice when we have someone close to home in one of these breakfast talks. And so Pete Catapano is a professor of history at City Tech. He teaches US history, history of immigration, and he's also, though he's got a background in film, and he's presented papers and written articles on numerous film and history topics, including on the Brooklyn waterfront and the film on the waterfront. In 2018, his book, The Hollywood Brand, Movies and Modernity, was published by Routledge. He earned his PhD in US history with a concentration in critical theory from the University of California, Irvine, and a master's degree in film and television studies from UCLA. So it is my pleasure to introduce Pete Catapano, and he's going to give us more background on these turbulent times on the Brooklyn docks. So Pete, please.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for that introduction. And I'm happy to be part of this breakfast talk. I was way back when working with Richard when the idea of having the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center, the germination of that idea. I also like to thank Joseph for, getting the word out about Pete Panto, who's also a name that I came across and really an important person that has been neglected. So I'm going to bring up a few slides I have, which includes some images. And what I wanted to do is just give kind of a basic rundown of why in 1953 a Waterfront Commission was created. So I'm going to sort of pick up the story where Joseph left off. And actually, I'm going to go back just a little bit. So I put together this timeline. One of the big antagonists, certainly for Panto, for the New York State Crime Commission, was the president of the ILA, which was Joseph Ryan. So I just wanted to foreground him a little bit. 1939, was the murder of Pete Panto. And as Joseph was giving his presentation, I was thinking about, about Panto in a little of the political context, because certainly a lot of the context has to do with conflict within the ILA. Right about 5 years before Panto is when Harry Bridges and the more left-wing, put it just simply, the more left-wing unionists in San Francisco split. And the reason I mention this is because that split happens around this time. Panto is an activist, and Bridges himself actually comes to New York to help organize an alternative longshoremen's union that doesn't really go very far. But I don't have any evidence, but I have to believe that Panto knew something about this activism. So there's a lot of activism, and Panto is certainly in Brooklyn, in New York, really one of the courageous leaders of that. So let me move forward to after World War II. What will bring to the public's attention about problems, corruption on the waterfront is a series of articles. This is going to be very important. In 1949, Malcolm Johnson of the New York Sun will win a Pulitzer Prize for this 24 articles that is a series called Crime on the Waterfront. And so a lot is happening, right? There's a lot of attention on the New York waterfront, I should say, 1949 through the early 50s. 1950, the Kefauver Committee was created and housed public hearings to investigate crime. In 51, around the same time, New York State Crime Commission, who will make the recommendation to create the Waterfront Commission, will be appointed by Thomas Dewey, and they will also have public hearings. And I just put here 1954 on the Waterfront wins an Academy Award, which just to give you some idea of sort of both the attention of the public, because it was a very popular movie, but also sort of an award-winning Pulitzer Prize series. Here's an Academy Award of a fictional story that really pieces together a lot of what really happened in this period, the late 40s, early 50s. So I just have a couple, really, some slides, a few images as well. There is Joseph Bryan. During World War II, he becomes a very popular within the Union, and actually he's elected with this honorary title, lifetime president of the ILO, but that's going to end 1953. He's going to resign his position in part because of all the investigation of the ILA. Another figure that's important, and I've written a lot on the movie and researched the movie on the Waterfront, and of course the Carl Malden priest character in many ways is based on John Corridon, who was known as the Waterfront priest. This is in Manhattan, in Chelsea. He comes to Francis Xavier Parish around 1946 and is an associate director of the Xavier Institute for Industrial Relations. And he met and talked to many of the longshoremen, so he was really on the docks himself. And he's an important source for Malcolm Johnson as he begins his investigation. So, and Corridon will also give testimony to the New York State Commission. And as I mentioned, Malcolm Johnson's Crime on the Waterfront series will identify a whole series of problems that will also be the same kind of issues that are brought up in more detail with the New York Crime Commission. There's something called the public loading racket, which limited who could actually take things off the dock, so that the union had a certain sort of monopoly over that, and they could also kind of extort money from the shippers more easily. There's the problem of theft and the union issues, extortion by hiring officials, especially in things like shape up. The organized crime figures also, of course, use their opportunities to use their other businesses, right? Loan sharking, gambling, as well. So 1950, the Kefauver Commission, I think, is a really important event that is also related to what's happening in New York, because it really, really brings not just to New York, but to the national audience, sort of the idea of organized crime and its influence in not just the docks and other business as well. And so these were public hearings, and it was widely covered in newspapers, national magazines. And they were among the first televised congressional hearings. 1950-51, not a lot of people had TVs yet, their own. But you can see from the image I have here, you could go to a theater and watch the Senate crime hearings. And there was that much interest that people would go to a theater to watch these hearings. And these hearings also brought organized crime figures to a national audience. And so some of the stars, if we can call them that, of the hearings are people that the public is going to get to know, and they're going to become part of even popular culture, identity of Italian Americans, unfortunately, in some cases, right? People like Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, right? These become names that people will talk about. So, you know, and Costello is an associate with Albert Anastasia, right? The person who most think was involved in the murder of Pete Panto. And so the Kefauver Commission brought names, faces, vocabulary, like Costa Nostra, Omerta, Mafia, all these terms. And so I think it made the public more willing or demanding, in some cases, something to be done. And in fact, these hearings are so popular, Kefauver runs for president in '52, loses the Democratic nomination to Stevenson, and runs as Stevenson's vice president in 1956. Another politician, someone who lost the presidency in '48, but still had ambitions as well, Thomas Dewey, called for a crime commission that would look at, as you can see from, this is the final report cover, as you can see, for remedying conditions on the waterfront of the Port of New York. And there's also public hearings. And this is where you'll see people like Ryan. And they will issue a report with recommendations that includes the creation of the Waterfront Commission. And some of the abuses mentioned by Joseph is the shape up, which is this really, really, right, awful competitive form of labor, right? Just people show up at the docks and hope they'll be called basically to work. And of course, it is rife with corruption, with payoffs, et cetera. And this is a photograph. This is from Manhattan Pier 92. And, you know, if we had more time, there's shots from on the waterfront that are almost copies of some of these photographs. So there's a kind of whole visual imagery and culture that's created that's circulating at this time. But of course, other forms of racketeering, extortion, and union corruption are identified by the State Commission. So in 1953, the commission is formed as part of the recommendations. Now, the act, and I'm sure there'll be more information and discussion. This is kind of out of my bailiwick, all the sort of legalities of it. But the commission was passed by both the state legislatures of New York and New Jersey and Congress. And the president at the time, Brett Eisenhower, signed the act into law at the end of the summer of '53. And so the Waterfront Commission's recommendations, when it comes to work especially, that are important. Their goal, of course, was to end corruption, modernize the docks, They did in fact replace the shape up with a state-run employment center. This is very important as well, and it's going to be a point of tension as well in years to come. State has to register licensed employers and union officials and dock workers. So the state is going to play a big role in that, including as barring individuals with criminal records as serving as union officials. Okay. And so there's going to be a much greater role of the government, right, in regulating labor practices. So I want to I'm going to end here with just a little bit of after 53. So immediately there's a lot of unhappiness with the commission, shippers and the unions, in part for different reasons at times, are just not happy with government interference in the hiring process. It did eliminate the shape up and the worst abuses, I would say, of the so-called casual labor system. And so people had more of a permanent sense of their jobs. And there was removal of some union leaders who I guess who had very obvious organized crime ties. Unfortunately, didn't eliminate all the criminal influence of the union. A lot who were fired were able to take lower jobs that weren't part of what the commission said had to be investigated. So there were ways around it. But it did eliminate sort of from the leadership to at least some degree. But the bigger changes in the conditions of labor are what's happening with containerization as we get into the 60s, and kind of the diminishing role of New York in the shipping industry. Important, but diminishing. So just for example, in 1953, about 40 to 50,000 workers showed up for the shape up, right? So it's thousands of workers, tens of thousands of workers. By 1980, we're talking about 8,000 registered workers. So much, much smaller workforce. 1953 as well, New York had this really, really important, almost stranglehold on the American economy because so much came through. About 20% of all exports and imports came through New York. As we get into 1970s, because of transformations in the global economy as well, and trade and et cetera, by 1970s, only about 8.4% of exports and imports will come through New York. So whatever kinds of regulations, of course, that we would have today would have to reflect the kind of new reality of labor and commerce on the ports, which are significantly different than the 1950s. So thank you, and that's I think that's my presentation for today.
Thank you, Pete. That was very, very thorough, and it sets us up for our last speaker, who's going to be, for our last speaker, who's going to be talking more about the commission and the legal ramifications that are going on now with it. But I just want to interject that the chat has been shut off for the moment, and the Q&A spam has been removed. And now, thanks to our two BWRC project coordinators, Jim Colombo and Jasmine Blackburn, they are feverishly working behind the scenes to clear up the mess, if you will. And so, so far, I think it is safe, if you have some questions, to start putting your questions in the Q&A now. And Jim and Jasmine are making sure that they are curated, if you will. So, so far there is one legit question, and we hope there are more after this final presentation by Rai Ravad, so that we can have some discussion on these issues. RIE covers energy, the environment, and transportation in New Jersey for Politico, and he joined there in 2021. He came from the Adirondack Explorer in New York, where he was an investigative reporter and wrote about pollution in one of America's most protected wilderness areas. His reporting, in partnership with the Times Union of Albany, was a finalist for a 2020 Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. Rye previously spent 5 years covering energy and Western water politics for the Voice of San Diego, and before that spent 2 years in Washington, D.C., writing about college finances and leadership for Inside Higher Ed. He started his career covering the West Virginia State House for the now defunct Charleston Daily Mail, one of the country's last afternoon dailies. He's a native of West Virginia and a graduate of West Virginia University. And so now I'm happy to introduce Rai Bavad, who's going to make his presentation.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll pick up where we just left off in the shift of the maritime industry, the shipping industry, from away from New York and into New Jersey is what ended up happening. I'll just talk and we'll take some questions later, hopefully. And I hope that I think I tweeted a link to the Zoom, and I hope that's not what caused the spam. Anyway, so what has happened over the years is, the shipping industry has really moved from New York to New Jersey in a pretty big way. You just saw some of those figures. There's only several thousand dock workers now. Most of the containers are being unloaded in New Jersey now, not in Red Hook, not in Chelsea, on the New York side. And that has created, I think, a political problem with the Waterfront Commission compact, which was, as we just learned, created back in the 1950s, at least for politicians in New Jersey. There was a 50-50 power sharing agreement. There was one commissioner from New York and one commissioner from New Jersey on the Waterfront Commission as it was originally structured. And that's the way it is today. And that's a little bit different from a lot of the other interstate agreements we see. If you look at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, it's a pretty big board. You traditionally have a chairperson who's from New Jersey and an executive director who is from New York. And then the governors of each state have a veto power over the minutes of the meeting, which effectively means if, the minutes are vetoed, what happened at the last meeting didn't happen. So there's this whole sort of structure to deal with political conflicts and sort of to avoid them and reach compromises. And that doesn't exist right now at the Waterfront Commission. And I think, the politicians that I've talked to in New Jersey would say that you have a bi-state agency regulating an industry that's largely in New Jersey at this point. And so, there has been tension over the past couple decades, really, about whether the Waterfront Commission should still exist in its current form or whether it should exist at all. And I think, a lot of this is fueled by labor and by the shipping industry, which don't like the regulation. They don't like, the oversight of the commission, at least as it's currently structured. And they think the commission is just sort of in their hair and getting in the way of things. And so we've talked a lot about, 2/3 of our discussion so far has been, about on the waterfront, about, the really early history of organized crime, when there was, as Malcolm Johnson's reporting suggested, more murders per square foot along the New York and New Jersey waterfront than anywhere else in the country, and the terrible, terrible times. And I think the question that's facing politicians today and leaders today is whether that's still the case. And New Jersey has decided that no, it's not, that this isn't a big deal. And to the extent that it is an issue, it's an issue that New Jersey wants to handle on its own and wants to put the state police in charge of this. And now we're in a Supreme Court case where New Jersey has been attempting to exit the Waterfront Commission since the early days of 2018. When Governor Chris Christie, on his last day in office, signed a law that he previously vetoed. Christie, a former federal prosecutor, vetoed a 2015 bill that would have pulled New Jersey out of the Waterfront Commission. And then, you know, as he's leaving office, he signs the bill into law. And Governor Murphy, who's come into office, Governor Phil Murphy, who's a Democrat, comes into office having promised the International Longshoremen's Association that he's going to, as he said in this campaign speech right before the election, we're going to figure out the damn Waterfront Commission once and for all. And he says this to this, you know, Union Hall, and everybody gets on their feet. They jump up, they're shouting, cheering. And it's just such an interesting moment, because it's clear that Murphy wants to get rid of this commission. Well, how did we get here? That we have a Republican former prosecutor and a Democrat with, you know, ties to organized labor, backing from organized labor, and they both want to get rid of this commission with this very storied history. And I think you have to go back a little bit further to 2009, when the New York Inspector General released this really damning report about the commission and found that you know, its general counsel at the time had orchestrated a scheme. Just a whole mess of things were going on at the commission, and it had to clean house. But the shipping industry and the union in particular said, look, we're not the corrupt ones, the commission is. And there's this great moment, you know, a year later, the New Jersey legislature is thinking about getting rid of the commission, pulling out of the commission. You know, this ILA local leader came in. He says the commission and the view of it is, you know, as outdated as this hook. And he's holding one of those hooks that you used to unload, you know, loose cargo sort of back in the 50s that we no longer use now because we have containers. And he said the commission is still living in 1953. Great moment, right? A couple months later, he was arrested on federal charges that he eventually admitted to conspiring to extort union members for Christmas time tribute payments. And this is sort of the tension that we're walking into right now, is that you have New Jersey politicians who are saying the commission doesn't need to exist, the police can handle it. You have the union saying, you know, things are totally different than they are, but some of the same people that are saying that are being charged, indicted, pleading guilty to some of the similar things that you would have found back in the 1950s. I did this really amazing interview with the architect of New Jersey's bill to pull out of the Waterfront Commission, this guy, Senator Ray Lesniak. And he told me, there may be crime on the waterfront, but, quote, not to any greater extent than organized crime is involved in any other activity in the state of New Jersey, which is a great line. Lesniak's an incredibly quotable fellow. You know, one-time aide of his back in January, just as an aside, pleaded guilty to hiring two people to kill someone. The aide has yet to be sentenced. But this is a kind of line that Joseph Ryan was using back when he was appearing before New York investigators in the 1950s. He said at the time, I don't see that there's any more crime on this waterfront than there is on any other waterfront or any other section of society. And if there is, I feel that our police and our district attorney and the rest of them are able to cope with it. And, you know, these decades later, New Jersey has sort of settled on this being not a bad reading of the situation. And so, you know, after Christie signs this law to pull out of the commission and Governor Murphy starts trying to effectuate it, they immediately get hit with a lawsuit, you know, by the Waterfront Commission itself, which is sort of interesting because the Waterfront Commission is suing to save itself. This gets tied up in court for years. The exit doesn't happen. You know, New Jersey is sort of stuck in this marriage with New York, regulating the industry in a way that doesn't want to be while this gets litigated. Eventually, the courts figure out the Waterfront Commission actually doesn't have standing to sue itself, kicks the case out. That was, you know, in late 2021. And so Murphy and the state police in New Jersey start getting together and figuring out, well, how are we going to pull out of this commission? The state police start, you know, figuring out or trying to figure out what is it the Waterfront Commission does? What do we need? They want an inventory of things of like boats, like, you know, how do we do this job? And they think that they can modernize it. They talk about modernizing it. You know, I had several conversations or, you know, was in several meetings with, you know, state police officials who talked about, you know, how they thought that the way that the Waterfront Commission was operating, you know, was a little bit antiquated, too much paper, not enough computers, stuff like that. And so they're getting ready. They're you know, they're investing in technology. They're starting to get their arms around, how they pull out of this commission. And all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, New York says, no, we want to stop this. And everybody is clear, even if the Waterfront Commission doesn't have standing to save itself, New York can sue New Jersey and say, hey, we entered into this agreement in the 1950s. It's a two-state agreement. One state can't just pull out of it all of a sudden. We're taking you to the Supreme Court. Cases like this, disputes between states, go directly to the Supreme Court. And so since this spring, we've been sort of waiting on the Supreme Court to figure out what it's going to do with this case. And so if you go to the Supreme Court docket, you'll just see just a spectacular amount of argument over what the commission's future should be and whether it should still exist. And it'll go through, many of the same things we've been talking about, where New Jersey says the police can do this. It isn't that big of a deal. The unions and the shipping industry will say, the industry has changed. It is not what it was in the 1950s. We don't need this particular type of regulator. But then you'll see New York saying, we're really afraid that without this commission, we're going to go back to where we were in the 1950s. If you look at some of the testimony from the current iteration of the Waterfront Commission, which has been around for 13 years since, the house was cleaned at the commission after this major investigation, found all these problems at the commission. They've done a whole lot of what they consider to be a whole lot of work. They've, assisted with 24 members and officials at the ILA and have pleaded guilty to conspiring. And I'm sorry, 24 members and officials of the ILA and mob pleaded guilty to conspiring to extort millions from dock workers, then funneled money to one of the crime families. Another ILA official had pleaded guilty to embezzling union funds. And the commission has said that it's kept over 300 people, quote, associated with organized crime, end quote, from either working on the docks or removing them from the docks if they were working there, and then found to be associated. And one of the major tensions, of course, is what is associated with organized crime. But they still believe, the Waterfront Commission still believes, and New York still believes that there's a role for this commission. And the case that New York and New Jersey have against each other raises, and this will be the sort of final point, some larger issues. I mean, the Supreme Court decided pretty quickly in this case that it wasn't going to try and deal with whether the commission should exist or not, whether there's organized crime or not. It's not trying to litigate, whether the commission's doing a good job. The thing that it will decide, and we'll probably find out soon when and if there are oral arguments, and they'll probably be next year. The thing that it's trying to decide is just a pure matter of law. They're not trying to get into the goods or bads of the commission, but the really simple legal question, which is obviously not a simple legal question because the Supreme Court is dealing with it, of whether New Jersey can unilaterally leave this bi-state compact. And New Jersey obviously thinks it can. New York obviously doesn't think it should be able to. The United States has weighed in basically on New Jersey's behalf. But then there's some academics in other states that are a little bit worried that a Supreme Court ruling could affect other interstate compacts, things like the Port Authority, things like the Colorado River Compact. And, it just sort of depends on what law professor you're talking to, what they think the Supreme Court siding with New Jersey would do or not do. And so I think we'll find out more about that. We'll obviously find out more about that in the coming year. But I'm happy to take more questions about the substance of it. But, the Supreme Court case is a Supreme Court case. There's really not much insight we have into it other than when the Department of Justice's Solicitor General sort of weighed in on New Jersey's behalf. That was a big thing. The Solicitor General is considered the 10th justice because they're so influential in cases. But, New York has good attorneys too. So we just don't know what the court's going to do. And I'll leave it there for questions.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for that succinct but thorough presentation. I do want to just take a note. I was speaking to my 10th grade granddaughter last night, looking over her shoulders. She was doing history homework, and they were looking at, what the Supreme Court does. And one of the issues was they take it's not everything is appealed to the Supreme Court, but it's the court of first jurisdiction when you have a conflict between two states. And I will have to go and tell her today that this is one of those areas. And okay, so we did manage to salvage our Q&A. I think the webinar chat will now contain a link to the to this Supreme Court docket and the files, and we'll also put on in the chat a link to the article that Joseph mentioned in the New York Times on Pete Panto, and as well as the article that I wrote for the for Politico. And now I want to start some questions, and I would ask the panelists to please put your cameras and audio back on, and we'll have some questions. And I would like this both, we'll take questions from the panelists. I have a couple of questions, and maybe the panelists can have questions for each other to have a discussion. And here's one for all of you, and maybe, is there anything particular about courts or docks that makes them so susceptible to corruption? And that I'll throw out to all of the panelists, and to see what makes docks so place. I mean, and is that corruption only endemic to the Port of New York, or is port corruption, as far as you know, something that, whether it's Maryland or Houston or the Port of Los Angeles, what makes docks so susceptible to corruption?
But just, I'll take two stabs at this. One is, the old saying, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. I mean, that's where the goods were and are still to this day. And that's where the jobs were, particularly back when we're talking about an earlier era, which other people can speak to better. I would say that the shipping industry, and I think to some extent the union, certainly would argue that there is less opportunity for corruption these days. Not only has the job market been regulated obviously much differently now than it was in the 1950s, but the containerization has created, the cargo is tracked. There isn't a lot of loose, bundles of bananas and crates of whiskey that you can just sort of, there's a cargo thing, and there's another cargo container, and they all have numbers, and they've all been tracked, or at least in theory can be tracked all the way across the world. So
not too many things fall off the truck anymore, as that famous phrase. It fell off the truck. Okay. Joseph, Pete, do you have?
Well, I mean, I think borders in general are always susceptible. First of all, obviously illegal smuggling, whether it's because they're goods that are illegal, say, especially international borders, or even state borders, I guess. International borders, there's a real financial interest in, bringing whatever it is across the border. There's also, like, anywhere where there's customs, there's advantages in taxes and all sorts of. Borders are interesting places in general, culturally, because they are a liminal zone. You're like the whole fight at the Supreme Court of who's in charge alone creates a kind of a little bit more of a free-for-all in terms of the rules. And so I think it is the money. I think it is that you are on the borders of differing jurisdictions, which make it more susceptible to all sorts of kind of corruption and smuggling and that sort of thing.
Okay. Joseph, you have?
I don't think I can answer your question directly, Richard. I'm definitely in agreement with Peter that sort of the liminal zone of ports, I mean, they've, historically been the site for all kinds of illicit behaviors, whether, involving robbing, but a whole slew of kinds of things. I'm reminded of two things. One, Peter mentioned sort of smuggling. We have to keep in mind that that image from a view, the scene from a view from the bridge, right, which is about the smuggling of undocumented Italian workers into the United States. And merchant marines, knowing the Italian-American situation, the Italian situation, Italian merchant marines were often jumping ship at the docks of New York City to get into to the United States. And so that it becomes a way in which, a place in which they can enter the States undocumented. I'm losing my throat here, my voice. I'll stop right now.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, Joseph was very generous today. He has COVID and recovering from, and he nevertheless came and told that story. And Joseph, we really appreciate you doing that for us. You're both Peter and Joseph talking about immigration and this tie. We have a question, a legit question in our Q&A, not one of the crazy spam things. It says, this is a question. It says, similarities between people showing up at the docks in the 1950s and hoping for work and immigrant day laborers now in many US cities hoping to get a job each day, ? So I guess, are there similarities from the shape-ups, and is that what, and Peter, you do immigration, so perhaps this is for you, is shape-up still, I mean, I know shape-ups still work, right? You go to a Long Island Home Depot in the morning and you'll see day laborers, basically a shape-up where contractors will go by and say, I need 3 men, and I'm sure it goes on in Brooklyn, but maybe any or all of you could speak to that.
Well, I actually, as bad as the shape up was in the 50s, I guess there are some, I think it's actually, it would be worse now, only because, well, I guess it's debatable. I mean, the shape up, they were union members, they're dues paying members. And if they did work, it was in the interest of the union at that point to make sure they got paid, because that's how they get paid. The problem with these casual workers now, especially if someone doesn't have legal status, is, I mean, incredible power of the employees, right? I'm just going to stiff my workers, and if you complain, I'm just going to call ICE, There really are zero standards, not just bad standards. But it is similar in that sense that it's very insecure. You don't know if you're going to work from one day to another. There indeed may be some forms of kickbacks. I'm not a real expert on that. Yeah, I mean, in that sense but I think the vulnerability, especially for immigrants, because of some cases, legal status adds another dimension.
Okay.
To the vulnerability. Yeah.
I just on the shape up issue at the port, one of the things I think that is being argued, maybe not explicitly, but the shipping industry, and I think the unions are arguing that the Waterfront Commission creates a constraint on the supply of labor, and they say that there are opportunity, that you could. They've used different arguments over the years, but really recently we can think about it in terms of the supply chain, that there's been, people out sick, there's more cargo, there's all kinds of things where you would want, if you're an industry, more laborers to be able to flood the zone and help unload ships. But because there has been this constraint on labor, there hasn't been a shapeup, because the shapeup was really a product of there were so many workers that some of them were willing to pay to get work. Where right now, where you have I think everybody would say at least a more even match of supply and demand for labor, there isn't that same opportunity. I think the Waterfront Commission supporters would say that if the shipping industry and the labor unions got their way, particularly the labor union, particularly the ILA, they would then want more laborers, and that would create another opportunity for a shape-up-like system, if not just like the shape-up, to exist where laborers would be willing to pay kickbacks for work. I think that's, we're sort of in a hypothetical world with that right now. And we also have to acknowledge, I think, that through a lot of different efforts, the Port of New York and New Jersey has been able to avoid the sort of crisis with labor that you've seen in other ports where they haven't been able to manage unloading ships. And so when tested against a really, really strong case study, a real life case study, labor has been able to meet the day. The shipping industry, I think, would argue that's, sort of by the, lucky. And in the future, they would want more laborers, and they wouldn't want the Waterfront Commission to not be there. But in the scenario that we have, the match is at least pretty good and much better than it was in the shape-up days.
Well, and also that shift in labor, I don't know how much of that really is the Waterfront Commission as much as the change of like containerization, because it really is collective bargaining which limited workers, because that's sort of the deal. Like we're not going to be able to hire as many people. And so actually the people who were members with seniority got pretty lucrative deals in the 60s, if you were longshoremen, compared to what, compared to the 50s, right? And so that was sort of you could argue a lot of ways about this, whether from the union perspective too, were these the older workers selling out younger workers, which sometimes unions have to do when there's this sort of pressures. So that explains, the reduced numbers, I think that's less of a I'm sure the commission has a role, but I think that's more just collective bargaining and just the realities of the changing dynamics of shipping. You just don't need as many. This railroad strike has a little of the similarities. These new sort of efficiency people just got the number of employees, and that's why they can't give sick days, because there's no mobility. They can't have people call in sick, or trains won't run. So the reduction of the number of laborers, I think, is less to do with the Waterfront Commission than some other factors, I would say.
Rye, I have this question. If the Supreme Court rules in the way, of letting one state unilaterally back out of a compact, does that have implications? You suggested it might. Does that have implications for things like the Port Authority, or how about the recent, with the infrastructure law, was there not a compact to get the third harbor rail tunnel built? Is that not also under the aegis of some kind of compact between New York and New Jersey? And is that is it the same kind of thing? Would a Supreme Court decision in the favor of New Jersey have potential effects in those other kinds of compacts?
I think that's an open question, and the new thing you're referring to is the Gateway Development Commission, which was created by New York and New Jersey to create the new two train tunnels across the Hudson. I think if you look into the Supreme Court filings from the different friends of the court and from New Jersey and New York themselves, you'll see arguments all over the place on this. New Jersey will say, look, we struck a deal with New York. It didn't really have a clear way of exiting this. We're done with this. We can't have entered a contract where our partner can keep us in indefinitely. We need to get out of it. New York's argument is, we had a deal. There's this bi-state agency. We both agreed to create it. We both need to agree to dissolve it. New York says, we don't want to dissolve it. We think it's important. And then you see people sort of around the fringes of this arguing, sort of extreme scenarios on both sides. They argue that the court could allow New Jersey to exit, and that really doesn't do anything else for any other compacts because the Waterfront Commission compact was written in a kind of interesting way. And then you see other, legal filings that suggest, oh, this could create concerns for any kind of compact. I mean, you have these really sort of complex compacts like the 7-state compact that was signed in 1922 to govern, the use of the Colorado River. Well, what if one state could pull out of that unilaterally? Then you have 6 other states that don't have water because one agreed it wanted to take all of the water. I mean, the Supreme Court is really going to have to wrestle with, if they agree with New Jersey, how do they write it so you don't create chaos? And I think one of the I don't want to go too far down this because it's a little bit above my head in sort of legal theories, but one of the outs that the Solicitor General gave the court is, what's affected here is police powers, which is a very particular kind of state sovereignty. And the Solicitor General basically said, New Jersey can't, have its police powers taken away forever against its will. And if you agree to that legal principle, New Jersey can leave this compact, but you wouldn't have, states leaving the Colorado River compact, or even, there's a compact that governs the Delaware River that New York and New Jersey have litigated over in the past. And New Jersey wouldn't be able to suddenly upend that if the court narrowly created a ruling that allowed New Jersey and other states in other scenarios to exit a compact agreement like the one that New Jersey is in now, which affects police powers.
Okay. Any other comments about is there, as you're talking about this, is there a given the current Supreme Court, given how explosive some of the things that they are covering, everything from within the last couple of days, the arguments on the election and the state legislature, total power, does this case have a identifiable liberal outcome, identifiable conservatives? Is it a conservative liberal kind of battle, or is it not that?
I think I don't know that it breaks down easily that way, but I do think if you look at it from a sort of states' rights view, you would or a states' rights lens, you would perhaps tend to agree with New Jersey, because you've created this sort of superstructure beyond the sovereignty of one state. And if one state says, well, wait, we don't like that anymore, I could see how a person who believed in states' rights would say, well, okay, we should side with New Jersey. But I don't know that it's sort of that clear of a breakdown.
Okay. I had a question for Ryan about so I get the idea about a state, right? The legal issue, but would Congress have to okay the split up, because Congress also authorized, right? Isn't there federal legislation that authorized some of these compacts? So would that somehow be nullifying federal law too, not just the autonomy of the state? So I'm sort of confused about that.
Yeah, I think that would be a question a bit above me, and one that we haven't really, the way it's been sort of portrayed is, can New Jersey unilaterally exit this, everything else aside? And I think the focus has sort of been on, can a state just say, well, we're done with this, and even if Congress is involved, like, we're done. And I think it's more just,
there are two questions that are sort of connected, and in the Q&A, and one says, what's the advantage to New Jersey if the commission gets disbanded? And then there's the flip side, what are New York's interests in maintaining this agreement beyond just limiting the precedents for multi-state compacts? So basically, what does New Jersey get out of it if it goes their way, and why does New York want it to continue?
I'll give you the sort of simple answer, then we can get into the complexities of each. New Jersey will say this doesn't change, the approach to policing. There won't be less enforcement of the law or less attention to organized crime if the New Jersey State Police are in charge, but this is a New Jersey industry, and New Jersey should regulate an industry that's largely in New Jersey. New York will say it's the harbor, it's New York Harbor. There are workers moving back and forth between the different ports in New York and New Jersey. The ILA is workers are sort of fluid. The industry is fluid. It still makes sense to regulate and have the same rules on both sides of these two state lines, because it's, in some ways functionally still a unified port in some ways. I think the complexity there is, New Jersey also says, we're trying to do our own thing. We don't want New York stepping on our ability to manage our own industry. We don't want New York able to impede our economic growth. I don't know that that's really happened, but that's an argument that New Jersey makes. And then I think on the New York side, it really isn't in their state anymore. So, why do they want 50% voice in an industry they have a 10% stake in? So, I mean, that's sort of a level down, and there's more there, but those are the sort of simple top level, responses.
Okay, thank you. I see no more questions. Would any of our panelists like to make some final statements about the topic, the Supreme Court? Roy, I'll ask you, do you have you've researched this? Not that you have a stake in it, but do you have something where you think, oh, it would be good if it went down this way or that? Do you?
No, it's been interesting to report on this and sort of wrestling with the different questions I've had for different officials on both sides, because it's sort of strange when you think about it that a state would want to shut down a police agency. And I remember this interview I had with some administration officials on the New Jersey side. I said, they're like, well, the Waterfront Commission hasn't eliminated organized crime, although it's not as big a deal as it used to be. And I said something like, well, the FBI hasn't eliminated the mob and it hasn't eliminated terrorism, but you're not proposing that we shut down the FBI or shut down the Newark Police Department because they haven't stopped all crime. And so that's an argument that I've been interested in sort of testing on the New Jersey side. And I don't know that there's like a great response to that. I do think we're sort of rethinking the way police agencies work, but I don't know that you would really throw this dispute into that camp. And that category of issues in the way that you would with, different issues about sort of more civilian policing. This is a kind of niche police agency. On the New York side, this was sort of sailing along. New York wasn't, the Cuomo administration didn't intervene in this. And then Hochul did it the last minute, which sort of caught, I think, New Jersey off guard. They thought they were going to get out of this thing without having to really fight it over in court. And so there is, I think, a pretty legitimate question about, like, why does New York care? New York will say it cares because it doesn't want to return to the 1950s and the 1940s. But, I think New Jersey is right to point out there's not much happening in Red Hook right now. I mean, there is shipping in Red Hook, but, we're not talking about the days gone by. This is largely a New Jersey industry now.
Okay. Well, with that, I will thank our panelists, Rye and Pete and Joseph, for doing this for us. Once again, to the audience, I apologize for the bombardment of obscene, racist, hateful chat and Q&As, and it looks like when you subscribe the webinar for Zoom, you get a contact at Zoom company. So I will now have to proceed, and his name is Glenn, and I'll ask Glenn, what do you do when this happens? I hope Zoom has some answers for us. And to our audience, thank you very much. And we appreciate your continuing to come and support the efforts of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. And Joseph, I wonder if I'm anxious to know when the stone goes up, and maybe you could send something. We'll put something up on the BWR site as well.
I certainly will.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, panelists, thank you, and I'll end it now. Bye.
Thank you.